Marcus Rivera thought he was coming home to settle an estate and walk away, but his German shepherd Duke had different plans. When the dog refused every command and led him through the dust-covered lobby of the abandoned Starlight Theatre, Marcus had no idea he was about to uncover a family secret that would shatter everything he believed about his late grandfather. The discovery waiting behind the crimson velvet curtains would reveal a sacrifice so profound it would change the course of his entire life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The call came on a Tuesday morning in November, cutting through the mundane quiet of Marcus Rivera's small apartment like a blade through silk. He had been cleaning his service weapon at the kitchen table, the familiar ritual of disassembly and maintenance providing the same methodical comfort it had for the past 12 years of military service. The scent of gun oil was sharp and reassuring, a constant in a world that had given him precious few constants. The phone's shrill ring felt intrusive in his carefully ordered space. Marcus answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a career soldier. Rivera speaking. Marcus, this is Janet Caldwell from Caldwell and Associates. The voice belonged to an older woman, professional but tinged with the kind of gentle formality reserved for difficult news. I'm calling regarding your grandfather's estate. I'm sorry to be the bearer of sad news, but Antonio Rivera passed away last Thursday. Natural causes, peacefully in his sleep. Marcus set down the cleaning rod he had been holding, his movements deliberate and controlled. The news settled over him like a heavy blanket, but it didn't bring the sharp pain he might have expected. His relationship with his grandfather had been complicated, marked by long silences and an emotional distance that had grown wider with each passing year. I see, Marcus replied, his tone neutral. What do I need to know about arrangements? The funeral was handled according to his wishes. Cremation, no service. He was quite specific about that. Janet's voice carried a note of apology. However, there is the matter of his property. You're listed as his sole beneficiary. The Starlight Theatre on Maple Street. I assume you're familiar with it. Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. The Starlight Theatre. Of course it was the theatre. The massive, crumbling monument to his grandfather's obsession, the thing that had consumed the old man's life and driven a wedge between them that had never healed. Yes, I know it, he said quietly. The building needs immediate attention, Janet continued. There are some legal matters to resolve, insurance issues, and frankly, the structure has been declining for years. You'll need to decide what to do with the property. I can recommend some real estate agents who specialize in commercial properties if you're looking to sell. Marcus stared out his apartment window at the gray November sky. Selling made perfect sense. It was the logical choice, the clean choice. The theater had been nothing but a source of frustration and disappointment for as long as he could remember. His grandfather had poured every penny, every moment of his life into that decaying building, neglecting everything else in the process, including his family. I'll need to see it first, Marcus heard himself saying, before I make any decisions. Of course. I can meet you there tomorrow if that works for you, say 2 in the afternoon. After ending the call, Marcus sat in the silence of his apartment, the half-cleaned weapon forgotten on the table before him. He looked over at Duke, his 8-year-old German shepherd, who was watching him with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Duke was more than just a companion, he was Marcus's anchor to the world. They had served 3 tours together in Afghanistan, where Duke had been trained as a bomb detection dog. The shepherd's nose had saved Marcus's unit more times than he could count, finding hidden explosives that would have claimed lives. When Marcus was medically discharged after an IED explosion damaged his left leg, Duke had been retired as well, and they had been inseparable ever since. Looks like we're taking a trip, boy, Marcus said, reaching over to scratch behind Duke's ears. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, a restrained show of enthusiasm that was characteristic of his disciplined nature. The drive from his apartment in Portland, Maine, to the small coastal town of Millfield took just over 2 hours. Marcus had made this journey countless times as a child, usually under protest, dragged along by parents who felt obligated to maintain some connection with the eccentric old man who owned the town's most prominent landmark. As familiar sights began to appear outside his truck windows, Marcus felt the old tension creeping into his shoulders. Millfield was the kind of place that time seemed to have forgotten, or perhaps abandoned. The main street was lined with weathered storefronts, many of them empty, their windows papered over or displaying faded "for rent" signs. The town had been dying a slow death for decades, its young people fleeing to larger cities in search of opportunities that simply didn't exist in this forgotten corner of New England. And at the heart of it all, like a great wounded beast, sat the Starlight Theater. Marcus pulled his truck to a stop across the street from the building and sat for a moment, taking in the sight that had loomed over his childhood like a persistent shadow. The theater had been built in 1923, during the golden age of cinema, and it had once been the crown jewel of Millfield. Its Art Deco facade was still elegant, despite decades of neglect, the geometric patterns in the stonework speaking to an era when craftsmanship mattered and buildings were constructed to last forever. But time had not been kind to the Starlight. The marquee, which had once blazed with hundreds of light bulbs announcing the latest Hollywood pictures, now hung dark and partially broken. Several of the letters had fallen out, leaving gaps like missing teeth. The brass fixtures were tarnished green, and the glass doors that led into the lobby were covered with plywood, their original beauty hidden behind weather-beaten boards. Duke whined softly from the passenger seat, sensing his master's tension. Marcus looked down at the dog and managed a reassuring pat. "It's just an old building, boy, just bricks and mortar." But even as he said it, Marcus knew it wasn't true. The Starlight Theater was much more than that. It was his grandfather's life's work, his passion, his obsession, and it was the reason Marcus had spent most of his adult life running from this place and everything it represented. Janet Caldwell was waiting for him outside the theater, a small, efficient-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She approached Marcus's truck as he climbed out, Duke immediately taking position at his left side. "Marcus, I presume," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm Janet. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." "Thank you for handling everything," Marcus replied, shaking her hand. "I appreciate you taking care of the arrangements." Janet's gaze moved to Duke, who was sitting at perfect attention, his dark eyes scanning the street with professional alertness. "Beautiful dog, military working dog, retired." "We both are." Marcus's response was brief, a habit born of years of deflecting questions about his service. "I see." Janet had the wisdom not to push. She turned toward the theater, pulling a heavy ring of keys from her purse. "Shall we take a look inside? I should warn you, it's been closed for almost 3 years now. Your grandfather, well, he wasn't able to maintain it properly toward the end." Marcus nodded, following her to the plywood-covered entrance. Janet selected an old brass key and inserted it into a lock hidden behind one of the boards. With some effort, she pulled the board aside, revealing the original glass doors beneath. The glass was dirty and spider-webbed with cracks, but still intact. The second key opened the theater itself, and the doors swung inward with a long, mournful creak that seemed to echo with the ghosts of 1,000 moviegoers. Marcus stepped into the lobby, Duke close at his heel, and was immediately hit by the smell of old velvet, dust and something else, something that reminded him of his childhood, though he couldn't quite place what it was. The lobby had once been magnificent. Even in its current state of decay, Marcus could see traces of its former glory. The ceiling was decorated with elaborate plasterwork, painted in gold and deep red, though much of it was now stained and cracked. A grand staircase swept up to what had once been the balcony level, its brass railings tarnished but still solid. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their bulbs long since burned out, their crystals clouded with dust. He spent most of his last years just trying to keep the roof from leaking. Janet said softly, her voice echoing in the vast space, "The heating system failed 2 winters ago, and he couldn't afford to fix it. That's when he finally had to close the doors for good." Marcus walked slowly through the lobby, his footsteps muffled by a carpet that had once been deep red, but was now faded to a dull burgundy. Movie posters from decades past still hung on the walls, their colors bleached and their edges curling. He recognized some of them from his childhood visits, classics like Casablanca, The Wizard of Oz, and Gone with the Wind. His grandfather had loved the old films, the ones from what he called the golden age of Hollywood. Duke remained close to Marcus's side as they moved through the lobby, but the dog seemed unusually alert. His ears were pricked forward, and his nose was working constantly, taking in the myriad scents of the old building. Occasionally he would pause and look toward the doors that led into the theater proper, his head tilted as if he were listening to something Marcus couldn't hear. "The main theater is through here," Janet said, approaching a set of heavy wooden doors fitted with brass handles. "I should mention, the electricity has been disconnected for months, so it's quite dark inside. I brought a flashlight." She pushed open the doors, and they stepped into the heart of the Starlight Theater.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Even in the dim light that filtered through from the lobby, Marcus could see that this space had retained more of its original grandeur than the rest of the building. Row upon row of red velvet seats stretched down toward a massive stage, their fabric worn but still intact. The walls were decorated with elaborate murals depicting scenes from classical mythology, and the domed ceiling was painted to look like a night sky, complete with twinkling stars that had once been illuminated by tiny lights. Janet clicked on her flashlight, sending a beam of white light dancing across the interior. "The seating capacity was 800, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. In its heyday, this was one of the finest theaters between Boston and Portland. Your grandfather used to tell me stories about the premieres they held here, the celebrities who came for special screenings." Marcus walked down the center aisle, running his hand along the arm rests of the seats. Each one was still solid, still comfortable despite its age. His grandfather had maintained them meticulously, even when the rest of the building was falling apart around them. It struck Marcus as both admirable and tragic, this dedication to preserving something beautiful, even as it became increasingly clear that no one else cared. Duke followed behind him, but the dog's behavior was becoming increasingly strange. He kept pausing, his nose to the floor, following some scent trail that was invisible to human senses. Several times he looked up at Marcus as if trying to communicate something urgent, but when Marcus called him to heel, the dog obeyed reluctantly. "He ran it as a revival house for the last 20 years, Janet continued, following them down the aisle. "Showing classic films, hosting the occasional live performance, he never made much money at it. I don't think profit was ever really the point for him. It was about preserving something he loved, keeping it alive for future generations." They reached the front of the theater, where a small orchestra pit separated the seating area from the stage. The stage itself was massive, designed to accommodate live theatrical productions, as well as the movie screen that could be lowered from the ceiling. Heavy crimson curtains hung from the fly gallery, their fabric dusty but still rich and luxurious. Marcus stepped up onto the stage, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. From this vantage point, looking out over the empty seats, he could almost imagine what it had been like in the theater's golden age. The seats filled with eager moviegoers, the air electric with anticipation, the huge screen flickering to life with the latest Hollywood epic. "Your grandfather spent most of his time up there," Janet said, gesturing toward the stage. "Even after he stopped showing films regularly, he would come in almost every day.
He said he was working on something, some kind of project, but he never told me what it was. Duke had been growing more and more restless throughout their tour of the theater. Now, standing on the stage, the dog seemed to reach some kind of decision. He moved away from Marcus's side, his nose to the floor, following a scent trail that led toward the wings of the stage. When he reached the heavy curtains that masked the backstage area, he stopped and looked back at Marcus, his amber eyes intense and purposeful. "Duke, come," Marcus called, but the dog ignored him. Instead, Duke pushed his nose against the curtains, trying to find a way through to whatever lay beyond. He let out a soft whine, a sound Marcus had learned to recognize during their years of service together. It was the sound Duke made when he had found something important, something that demanded immediate attention. "Is there something back there?" Marcus asked Janet, nodding toward the curtains. "The backstage area, yes, dressing rooms, storage areas, the fly gallery controls. I haven't been back there in years, to be honest. Your grandfather always said it wasn't safe. Some of the floorboards were loose, and the lighting back there was poor." Duke whined again, more insistently this time. He pawed at the curtains, trying to push through them. Marcus had learned to trust his partner's instincts implicitly. During their deployment, Duke's nose had saved their unit countless times, detecting hidden explosives that would have claimed lives. The dog's behavior now was identical to how he acted in the field when he had located something significant. "I think he wants to investigate," Marcus said. "Do you have a stronger flashlight in your car?" Janet looked uncertain. "Marcus, I really don't think it's safe back there. The building is old, and there could be structural issues we're not aware of." "Duke wouldn't be acting this way unless he sensed something," Marcus replied. "He's trained to detect things that humans miss. If he thinks there's something worth investigating, I trust his judgment." Janet hesitated for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "There's a heavy-duty flashlight in my car, but please be careful. The last thing we need is for someone to get hurt." While Janet went to retrieve the flashlight, Marcus knelt beside Duke and scratched behind the dog's ears. "What is it, boy? What do you smell back there?" Duke looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, then back toward the curtains. The dog's entire body was tense with anticipation, his tail held low and still. It was the same posture he had adopted in Afghanistan when he had detected explosives, a combination of alertness and restraint that spoke to years of rigorous training. Janet returned with a powerful LED flashlight that threw a brilliant white beam across the stage. "This should help," she said, handing it to Marcus. "But please be very careful back there." Marcus switched on the flashlight and approached the curtains. Up close he could see that they were even more impressive than they had appeared from a distance. The fabric was heavy velvet, deep crimson in color, with gold trim along the edges. They hung from a complex system of ropes and pulleys that allowed them to be raised and lowered for different types of performances. He found an opening between two of the panels and pushed through into the backstage area. The space beyond was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, small rooms, and mechanical equipment. The beam of his flashlight revealed old theatrical flats leaning against the walls, painted with scenes from long-forgotten productions. Costume racks stood empty, their hangers gleaming dully in the light. Duke immediately moved ahead, his nose to the floor, following his invisible trail with single-minded determination. Marcus followed, playing the flashlight beam across the walls and floor, looking for whatever had caught the dog's attention. The backstage area was larger and more complex than Marcus had expected. There were dressing rooms with mirrors surrounded by old-fashioned light bulbs, prop storage areas filled with dusty furniture and artificial flowers, and a workshop area where sets had once been constructed. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air was stale and musty. Duke led him deeper into the maze of backstage rooms, past a collection of old theater programs tacked to a bulletin board, past racks of period costumes that looked like they hadn't been worn in decades. The dog's behavior was becoming more and more focused, his movements quick and purposeful. They emerged into what appeared to be the main backstage area, a large open space directly behind the stage proper. This was where actors would have waited for their cues, where sets would have been changed between scenes. The walls were lined with ropes and pulleys for operating the fly gallery, and the floor was marked with tape indicating where different set pieces should be positioned. But it was what Duke had found in the center of this space that made Marcus stop in his tracks. There, illuminated by the beam of his flashlight, was a large wooden desk that looked completely out of place in the theatrical setting. It was an old-fashioned roll-top desk, the kind that might have belonged in a study or library. The wood was dark oak, polished to a deep shine despite the dust that covered everything else in the backstage area. What made the desk even more remarkable was its condition. Unlike everything else backstage, it appeared to have been maintained with care. The brass fittings gleamed, and there were no signs of the decay that had affected the rest of the building. It was as if someone had been coming back here regularly, taking care of this one piece of furniture while allowing everything else to deteriorate. Duke sat down in front of the desk, his training taking over. He looked up at Marcus expectantly, waiting for his next command. The dog had done his job. He had found whatever he had been tracking. Now it was up to Marcus to investigate further. Marcus approached the desk slowly, playing his flashlight beam over its surface. The roll top was closed, secured with a small brass lock that looked like it had been recently polished. On top of the desk were several objects that seemed to have been placed there with deliberate care: an old-fashioned fountain pen, a leather-bound ledger, and what appeared to be a small framed photograph. He picked up the photograph first, wiping away a light coating of dust with his sleeve. The image was black and white, and it showed a much younger version of his grandfather, Antonio Rivera, standing on the stage of the Starlight Theater. He was dressed in a formal suit, his dark hair slicked back in the style of the 1950s, and he was smiling broadly at the camera. Behind him, the theater was filled with people, and everyone appeared to be celebrating something. Marcus studied the photograph more closely, trying to understand what he was seeing. His grandfather looked happy in a way that Marcus had never seen him in person. The old man, he remembered, had been serious, distant, always focused on the theater to the exclusion of everything else. This younger version seemed full of life and joy. The leather ledger was filled with entries written in his grandfather's careful handwriting. Marcus opened it to a random page and found himself reading what appeared to be a log of events at the theater. October 15, 1967, showed the sound of music to a packed house. Mrs. Patterson brought her entire family, including the baby who slept through the entire film. Made enough tonight to fix the heating system before winter. December 24, 1969, Christmas Eve showing of It's a Wonderful Life. Only 12 people came due to the snowstorm, but we went ahead with the screening anyway. Sometimes the magic isn't about the size of the audience. Marcus flipped through more pages, finding similar entries dating back decades. His grandfather had been keeping detailed records of every screening, every event, every moment of the theater's life. The entries were filled with small observations about the patrons, notes about repairs needed, and occasional personal reflections on the films he was showing. But it was what he found when he managed to work the small brass lock on the roll top that truly stunned him. Inside the desk were dozens of manila folders, each one carefully labeled and organized. Marcus opened the first one and found himself looking at architectural drawings of the theater, plans for renovations that had never been completed, and estimates from contractors for various repair projects. The second folder contained financial records, and Marcus's heart sank as he realized what he was seeing. Page after page of loan documents, mortgage papers, and bank statements painted a clear picture of a man slowly going broke in his effort to keep the theater alive. His grandfather had mortgaged and remortgaged the building multiple times, always hoping that the next loan would be the one that allowed him to make the necessary repairs and attract enough customers to make the theater profitable again. The third folder was different. It was labeled for Marcus in his grandfather's careful handwriting. With trembling hands, Marcus opened it and found a thick stack of letters, all addressed to him but never sent. The earliest was dated just after Marcus had enlisted in the army more than 12 years ago. He unfolded the first letter, his grandfather's familiar handwriting swimming in the beam of his flashlight. "My dear Marcus, I know you think I don't understand why you had to leave Millfield, why you had to get away from this place and from me. The truth is, I understand better than you know. I was young once too, and I felt the same need to escape, to find my own path in the world. But I want you to know that every day since you left, I have been proud of you for having the courage to follow your dreams." Marcus had to stop reading. His hands were shaking, and he felt a tightness in his chest that made it difficult to breathe. These were the words he had waited his entire life to hear from his grandfather, expressions of pride and understanding that the old man had apparently felt but never been able to say aloud. Duke, sensing his distress, moved closer and pressed his warm body against Marcus's leg. The dog's presence was comforting, grounding him in the present moment, even as the letters threatened to pull him into a whirlpool of regret and emotion. He forced himself to continue reading. "I know I was never good at showing my feelings, at saying the things that needed to be said. Your grandmother always told me I was too proud, too stubborn, too afraid of appearing weak. She was right, of course. She usually was. But I want you to know that not a day has passed since you left that I haven't thought about you, worried about you, and hoped that you were happy wherever you were." The letter went on for several pages, filled with his grandfather's thoughts about Marcus's childhood, memories of the times they had spent together in the theater, and expressions of regret about the emotional distance that had grown between them over the years. Marcus opened the next letter, dated 2 years later. "I heard from your father that you were deployed overseas. I cannot sleep for worrying about you. I go to the theater every morning and every evening, and I pray to God to keep you safe. I know I have no right to ask anything of him, having been such a poor example of faith and family, but if he is listening, I hope he knows how much you mean to me." Letter after letter revealed the same pattern. His grandfather pouring his heart out on paper, expressing all the love and concern and pride that he had never been able to communicate in person. Each letter was a window into the old man's soul, showing Marcus a side of him that he had never suspected existed. The most recent letter was dated just 6 months ago. "Marcus, I know I am running out of time. The doctors tell me my heart is failing, and I can feel the truth of it in my chest. I have spent my whole life trying to save this theater, pouring everything I had into preserving something beautiful for future generations. But I realize now that I made a terrible mistake. I should have spent that time and energy on preserving my relationship with my family, with you. I am writing this letter hoping that someday you will come back to Millfield, that you will find these words and understand that everything I did, every sacrifice I made, was because I believed in the importance of preserving beauty and art and culture. But I also want you to know that if I could do it all over again, I would choose you. I would choose family. I would choose love." Marcus had to set the letter down. The beam of his flashlight was wavering as his hands shook, and he could feel tears building behind his eyes. All these years, he had believed that his grandfather cared more about the theater than about him. All these years, he had carried the weight of feeling unloved and unimportant, but the truth was right here in front of him, written in his grandfather's careful script. The old man had loved him deeply, had worried about him constantly, had been proud of him every step of the way. He simply hadn't known how to express those feelings in words. Duke whined softly and nudged Marcus's hand with his nose. The dog could sense his emotional distress and was offering the only comfort he knew how to give, his simple, unwavering presence. Marcus reached down and scratched behind Duke's ears, drawing strength from the familiar contact. "You knew, didn't you, boy? he whispered. "You knew there was something here I needed to find." There was still more in the folder marked with his name. Marcus found a copy of his grandfather's will, which left him not only the theater building, but also a small savings account that the old man had somehow managed to keep intact despite his financial struggles. There was also a letter from an insurance company, confirming that the theater was fully covered for fire, flood, and structural damage. But it was the final document that truly took Marcus's breath away. It was a business plan, professionally prepared and meticulously researched, outlining a comprehensive renovation of the Starlight Theatre. The plan called for updating the electrical and mechanical systems, restoring the original Art Deco decorations, and converting part of the building into a community arts center that would host live performances, art exhibitions, and film screenings. Attached to the business plan were estimates from contractors, quotes for materials, and even preliminary sketches showing how the theater might look after renovation. His grandfather had spent the last years of his life not just dreaming about saving the theater, but making concrete plans to do it. The final page of the business plan contained a handwritten note from his grandfather. "Marcus, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you are faced with a decision about what to do with the theater. I know it may seem like a burden, this old building with all its problems and expenses, but I hope you will consider the possibility that it could be something else entirely. It could be a gift, a chance to create something beautiful, to bring art and culture and community back to Millfield. I cannot do this work anymore, but you could. You have the strength and the vision that I lacked. You could make the Starlight Theatre live again." Marcus sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had discovered. His grandfather hadn't been the distant, obsessed old man he had always believed him to be. He had been a dreamer, a preservationist, a man who believed in the power of art and beauty to transform communities and bring people together. And more than that, he had been a grandfather who loved his grandson deeply, but had never learned how to express that love in words. Every hour he had spent working on the theater, every dollar he had invested in its preservation, every dream he had harbored about its future, it had all been in his mind a legacy he was building for Marcus. Duke stood up and moved to the edge of the backstage area, looking out toward the main theater through a gap in the curtains. His posture was relaxed now, his mission accomplished. He had led Marcus to what he needed to find, and now he was ready for whatever came next. Marcus gathered up the letters and documents, handling them as carefully as if they were made of the finest crystal. These papers were more than just family history. They were a roadmap to understanding who his grandfather had really been, and perhaps more importantly, they were a blueprint for who Marcus himself might become. As he prepared to leave the backstage area, Marcus took one last look around the space where his grandfather had apparently spent countless hours planning and dreaming. The old man had created a private sanctuary here, a place where he could work on his plans for the theater's future, while surrounded by the ghosts of its glorious past. Walking back through the maze of backstage rooms, Marcus saw them with new eyes. These weren't just storage areas filled with forgotten props and costumes. They were the workshops and dressing rooms where generations of performers had prepared to bring stories to life. They were part of a living history that his grandfather had understood and cherished. When he emerged onto the main stage, Janet was waiting for him, her face creased with concern. "Did you find whatever Duke was looking for?" she asked. Marcus looked down at the folder in his hands, then out over the empty seats of the theater. 800 seats that had once been filled with families and couples and children, all sharing in the magic of storytelling. 800 seats that could be filled again, if someone had the vision and the determination to make it happen. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think I found exactly what I was looking for." The drive back to his apartment in Portland felt like traveling through a different world entirely. Marcus kept the folder of letters on the passenger seat beside him, occasionally glancing over at the worn manila cover, as if to confirm that what he had discovered wasn't some elaborate dream. Duke sat in the back seat, his amber eyes watching the familiar landscape roll by, seemingly satisfied that his mission had been accomplished. Marcus's mind was reeling from the revelations in his grandfather's letters. Every assumption he had made about the old man, every bitter memory of feeling ignored and unimportant, now seemed to crumble under the weight of the truth. Antonio Rivera had loved him deeply, had thought about him constantly, had built his entire life around creating something meaningful to pass down to his grandson. The silence that Marcus had interpreted as indifference had actually been the quiet devotion of a man who expressed his love through action rather than words. When he reached his apartment, Marcus spread the contents of the folder across his kitchen table, organizing the documents into careful piles. The letters formed one stack, arranged chronologically so he could read them in the order they had been written. The business plan occupied another section of the table, its pages detailed with architectural drawings, financial projections and contractor estimates. The insurance papers and legal documents created a third pile, dry but essential reading that would determine what was actually possible. Marcus poured himself a cup of coffee and settled into his chair, Duke lying down nearby with his head resting on his paws. The dog's presence was comforting as Marcus began the emotional journey of reading through 12 years of his grandfather's unspoken thoughts and feelings. The second letter, dated 3 months after Marcus had completed basic training, revealed more of Antonio's character than Marcus had ever glimpsed in person. His grandfather wrote about visiting the Army's website to learn about Marcus's unit, about staying up late reading news reports from Afghanistan, about the pride he felt when he told people in town that his grandson was serving his country. But underneath the pride was a current of worry that ran through every paragraph. "I find myself going to the theater earlier each morning," Antonio had written. "Not because there is more work to be done, but because I need somewhere quiet to pray for your safety. I sit in the front row where we used to watch movies together when you were small, and I talk to your grandmother. I tell her about the man you're becoming, about the courage you're showing by serving something bigger than yourself. I like to think she can hear me, and that maybe she can watch over you in ways that I cannot." Marcus remembered those childhood movie nights, though his recollection of them was quite different from what his grandfather described. He had always felt that Antonio was distracted during their time together, more focused on the technical aspects of running the projector or maintaining the sound system than on spending quality time with his grandson. Now he realized that his grandfather had probably been trying to share his passion for the theater, to pass on his knowledge and love for the building that defined his life. The third letter was written after Marcus had been promoted to sergeant, though Marcus had never told his grandfather about the promotion directly. Somehow, Antonio had found out, probably through Marcus's parents, who maintained sporadic contact with the old man despite the family tensions. "I heard about your promotion, and I could not be more proud," the letter read. "Leadership is not something that can be taught in books or lectures. It comes from within, from a strength of character that allows a person to put the welfare of others above their own comfort and safety. You have always had that strength, even as a child. I remember when you were 8 years old, and you found that injured bird in the theater's alley. You insisted we take it to the veterinarian, even though it meant missing the movie you had been looking forward to all week. That kind of compassion and selflessness is what makes a true leader." Marcus had completely forgotten about the injured bird, but as he read his grandfather's account, the memory came flooding back with startling clarity. He could suddenly recall the weight of the small sparrow in his hands, its rapid heartbeat against his palms, and his desperate need to help the creature even though he knew very little about birds or their care. His grandfather had driven him to the animal clinic without complaint, had paid the veterinary bill without comment, and had even helped Marcus build a small recovery cage in the theater's storage room.
At the time, Marcus had thought his grandfather was merely indulging a child's whim. Now he understood that Antonio had seen something deeper in that moment, had recognized a quality in his grandson that he wanted to nurture and celebrate.
The old man had been paying attention to Marcus's character development in ways that the boy had never realized. The fourth letter was perhaps the most difficult to read, written after Marcus's first serious injury in Afghanistan. An improvised explosive device had detonated near his convoy, and while Marcus had escaped with relatively minor injuries to his left leg and hearing damage in one ear, two of his fellow soldiers had not been so fortunate. The letter revealed that Antonio had somehow learned not only about the incident, but about the casualties in Marcus's unit. "I cannot imagine the weight you must be carrying right now," his grandfather had written. "To see friends hurt or killed, to survive when others do not, creates a burden that no textbook or training manual can prepare you for. I know because I carried a similar weight after your grandmother died. The guilt of being the one left behind, the questions about why fate chose you to continue when someone you cared about was taken away." The letter went on to describe Antonio's own struggle with survivor's guilt after his wife's death from cancer. Marcus had been 12 when his grandmother passed away, old enough to understand the loss but too young to comprehend the depth of his grandfather's grief. He remembered the funeral, remembered the way Antonio had stood silent and stoic throughout the service, accepting condolences with polite nods but showing no visible emotion. Now reading his grandfather's private thoughts, Marcus realized that the old man's stoicism had been a kind of armor, a way of protecting himself and others from the full force of his pain. Antonio had thrown himself even deeper into his work at the theater after his wife's death, not because he cared more about the building than about his family, but because work was the only way he knew how to cope with grief that threatened to overwhelm him. "The theater became my lifeline after she died," the letter continued. "Not because I loved it more than I loved her, but because it was the one thing that still connected me to the world of the living. Every movie I showed, every event I hosted, was a small act of defiance against the darkness that wanted to pull me down. I kept the theater alive because I needed to prove to myself that beautiful things could still exist in a world that had taken away the most beautiful thing I had ever known." Marcus set the letter down and walked to his kitchen window, looking out at the grey November sky. He was beginning to understand that his grandfather's relationship with the theater had been far more complex than he had ever realized. The building wasn't just a business or even a passion project. It was Antonio's way of staying connected to life, hope, and beauty in the face of devastating loss. Duke padded over and pressed his warm body against Marcus's leg, sensing his emotional state. Marcus reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, drawing comfort from the simple, uncomplicated affection that animals could provide. In many ways, Duke served the same function in Marcus's life that the theater had served in his grandfather's. Both were anchors that kept them tethered to purpose and meaning when the weight of experience threatened to pull them into despair. Returning to the table, Marcus picked up the fifth letter, which had been written during his second deployment. This one was shorter than the others, but its brevity made it no less powerful. "I know you cannot write to me directly," Antonio had written. "I understand that there are things you cannot share, dangers you cannot discuss, experiences that must remain private between you and your fellow soldiers. But I want you to know that I think about you every single day. When I raise the flag outside the theater each morning, I say a prayer for your safety. When I turn on the stage lights each evening, I imagine you somewhere under the same sky, and I hope you can feel the love I am sending across all those miles." The image of his grandfather raising the American flag outside the theater each morning was one that Marcus had never considered. He had always seen the flag as just another piece of the theater's decoration, no different from the marquee or the movie posters. Now he understood that it had been a daily ritual of remembrance and hope, Antonio's way of honoring his grandson's service and maintaining a connection across the vast distance that separated them. The sixth letter revealed another layer of his grandfather's character, written after Marcus had been awarded a Bronze Star for his actions during a particularly difficult mission. Once again, Antonio had somehow learned about the commendation, probably through official channels or through Marcus's parents. I went to the library and read everything I could find about the Bronze Star, the letter read. I wanted to understand what you had done to earn such recognition, though I know the full details will probably remain classified. What I learned is that this medal is given for acts of heroism, for putting your own life at risk to protect others. I am proud beyond words, but I am not surprised. You have always been willing to sacrifice for others, even when you were too young to understand the true cost of such sacrifice. Marcus remembered the mission that had earned him the Bronze Star, though he tried not to think about it often. His unit had come under heavy fire while providing security for a medical convoy in a remote village. When the medics became pinned down by sniper fire, Marcus had voluntarily crossed open ground to reach them, drawing enemy fire away from the wounded soldiers and civilians they were treating. It had been a split-second decision made under extreme stress, the kind of action that felt necessary in the moment, but terrifying in retrospect. His grandfather's pride in that moment meant more to Marcus than he had expected. He had never shared the details of his military service with his family, partly for security reasons but mostly because he didn't think they would understand the complexities of what he had experienced overseas. The knowledge that Antonio had taken the time to research and comprehend the significance of the Bronze Star showed a level of engagement and interest that Marcus had never suspected. The 7th letter was written during Marcus's 3rd deployment, and it revealed that Antonio's health was beginning to decline. His handwriting was slightly less steady than in the earlier letters, and he mentioned having difficulty with some of the physical demands of maintaining the theater. "The arthritis in my hands is getting worse," he had written. "Some days I can barely manage to thread the film through the projector, and I have to rest between tasks that used to be simple. I am starting to accept that I may not be able to keep the theater running much longer, at least not in the way I have always done. But I am not ready to give up on it entirely. There are still too many stories that need to be told, too many memories that deserve to be preserved." The letter went on to describe Antonio's vision for the theater's future, ideas that would later be developed into the comprehensive business plan that Marcus had found in the desk. Even as his physical capabilities were diminishing, his grandfather was thinking creatively about how to ensure the theater's survival. He wrote about the possibility of converting part of the building into a community center, about hosting live performances and art exhibitions, about creating educational programs that would introduce young people to the magic of film and theater. "I know I am running out of time," the letter concluded, "but I am not running out of hope. Somewhere, somehow, I believe there is a future for this place. Maybe not the future I originally imagined, but a future nonetheless. Maybe a future that you could be part of, if you ever decided to come home." Marcus felt a pang of regret as he read those words. His grandfather had been reaching out to him, had been hoping for his involvement in preserving the theater, but Marcus had been too wrapped up in his own assumptions and grievances to recognize the invitation. He had seen Antonio's focus on the theater as evidence of misplaced priorities, when in reality it had been the old man's way of creating something meaningful that could bring them together. The 8th letter was written after Marcus's medical discharge from the army, following the IED explosion that had damaged his leg and ended his LEDIC career. The tone of this letter was different from the others, more urgent and emotional. "I heard about your injury, and I have been sick with worry," Antonio wrote. "Your father tells me that you are recovering well, but I know that the wounds we cannot see are often more serious than the ones that show. I have been where you are now, facing the end of one chapter of life without knowing what the next chapter will bring. It is a frightening and lonely place to be." The letter went on to describe Antonio's own experience of major life transitions, particularly his decision to take over the theater from its previous owner in the 1960s. He had been working as a projectionist at the time, with no business experience and very little money, but he had seen an opportunity to preserve something beautiful and important for future generations. "People told me I was crazy to buy the theater," he wrote. "They said it was a dying industry, that television would kill the movie business, that I would lose everything I had invested. Some of those predictions turned out to be true. The business was much harder than I expected, and there were times when I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. But I never regretted the decision to try. Even in the worst financial years, even when I had to choose between paying for repairs and paying for groceries, I never regretted the attempt to keep something beautiful alive in the world." Marcus recognized the parallel his grandfather was drawing. Just as Antonio had faced uncertainty after taking over the theater, Marcus was now facing his own transition from military to civilian life, unsure of his purpose or direction. The letter was his grandfather's way of offering guidance and encouragement, sharing the wisdom he had gained from his own experience of navigating major life changes. "Whatever you decide to do next," the letter continued, "remember that the most important choices in life are rarely the safest ones. The things that matter most, the things that make life worth living, almost always require us to take risks and accept uncertainty. The theater taught me that every night I showed a film, I was taking a small risk that no one would come, that the equipment would break down, that something would go wrong. But the reward for taking that risk was the chance to share stories and create moments of magic and wonder for people who needed those experiences in their lives." The 9th letter was written just 2 years ago, and it revealed that Antonio's health problems were becoming more serious. He mentioned having heart trouble and difficulty breathing, symptoms that would eventually lead to his death. But even as his physical condition deteriorated, his mental focus remained sharp, and his dedication to the theater never wavered. "The doctors tell me I should be taking things easier," he wrote. "They want me to sell the theater and move into one of those retirement communities where everything is taken care of for you. They don't understand that the theater is not just my business or my hobby. It is my purpose, my reason for getting up each morning. Without it I would just be an old man waiting to die." The letter described Antonio's daily routine during his final years, a schedule that revolved entirely around maintaining the theater even though it was no longer showing films regularly. He would arrive each morning to check for problems, spend hours cleaning and organizing, and work on his plans for the building's restoration. In the evenings he would sit in the empty theater and watch classic films on the big screen, often movies that he had shown dozens of times over the years. "I know it probably seems foolish to you," he wrote, "an old man sitting alone in a huge theater, watching movies that he has already seen countless times, but those evenings are when I feel closest to all the people who have shared this space over the years. I can almost hear the laughter from audiences who enjoyed comedies here, feel the tension during suspenseful moments, sense the tears that were shed during romantic scenes. The theater holds all of those emotions, all of those memories, and when I sit here alone, I am not really alone at all." Marcus found himself deeply moved by this description of his grandfather's evening ritual. He had always thought of Antonio as a somewhat cold and practical man, focused on the technical aspects of running the theater rather than on the emotional experiences it provided for audiences. Now he realized that his grandfather had been deeply attuned to the human dimension of what the theater represented, that he had understood its power to create shared experiences and lasting memories. The 10th letter was the most recent, written just 6 months before Antonio's death. His handwriting was noticeably weaker, and there were several places where he had stopped and restarted, as if the physical act of writing had become difficult for him. "Marcus, I am running out of time, and there are things I need you to know," the letter began. "I have made many mistakes in my life, but the biggest mistake was never finding the words to tell you how much you mean to me. I know I was not the grandfather you deserved, not the warm and affectionate figure that other children had in their lives. But please understand that my love for you was never in question, even when my ability to express that love failed me. The letter went on to describe the regrets that had haunted Antonio throughout Marcus's childhood and young adulthood. He wrote about opportunities he had missed to connect with his grandson, about times when he should have put aside his work to focus on family, about the wall of silence that had grown between them, despite his desperate wish to bridge that gap. I told myself that I was working so hard to preserve the theater because it would be something valuable to leave to you, he wrote. But the truth is more complicated than that. The theater became my refuge from difficult emotions, from the fear of saying the wrong thing or not being enough for the people I loved. It was easier to pour my energy into fixing broken equipment than into fixing broken relationships. The honesty of this admission was heartbreaking. Marcus could see that his grandfather had been aware of the emotional distance between them, but had felt powerless to change it. Antonio had been trapped by his own personality and upbringing, unable to break through the barriers that kept him from expressing his feelings directly.
But I want you to know that everything I have done, every sacrifice I have made, has been motivated by love for you and hope for your future, the letter continued. The theater represents my belief that beautiful things deserve to be preserved, that art and culture and shared experiences have value that goes beyond money or practical considerations. If you decide to take over the theater someday, you would not just be inheriting a building, you would be inheriting a mission, a commitment to keeping something meaningful alive in a world that often seems to value only what is new and profitable. Marcus set down the letter and rubbed his eyes, which were stinging with unshed tears. The full weight of his grandfather's love and sacrifice was becoming clear to him, and with that understanding came a crushing sense of lost opportunities. All the years he had spent feeling unloved and unimportant, all the resentment he had carried toward the old man, had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Antonio's character and motivations. Duke seemed to sense his emotional state and moved closer, resting his chin on Marcus's knee. The dog's warm brown eyes were full of concern and affection, a simple but powerful reminder that love could be expressed in many ways beyond words. Perhaps that was something his grandfather had tried to show him all along, through his careful maintenance of the theater, through his dedication to preserving something beautiful for future generations. Marcus turned his attention to the business plan that his grandfather had developed during his final years. The document was incredibly detailed, clearly the result of months or even years of research and planning. It began with a comprehensive assessment of the theater's current condition, identifying structural problems, electrical issues, and mechanical systems that needed to be updated or replaced. The financial projections were sobering but not impossible. Antonio had estimated that a complete renovation would cost approximately $800,000, a substantial sum, but not beyond the reach of someone willing to take on significant debt or seek investors. The plan outlined several potential funding sources, including historical preservation grants, community development funds, and private donations from individuals and businesses with connections to the theater's history. What impressed Marcus most about the business plan was its vision for the theater's future role in the community. Rather than simply restoring the building to its original function as a movie house, Antonio had envisioned a multi-purpose cultural center that would serve a variety of needs. The main theater would still show films, but it would also host live performances, lectures, and community events. The building's basement could be converted into rehearsal spaces and classrooms for drama and music programs. The plan included detailed market research, showing that there was genuine interest in such a facility. Antonio had apparently surveyed residents throughout the region, asking about their interest in attending various types of cultural events. The responses showed strong support for live theater, classic film screenings, and educational programming,
particularly among older adults who remembered the theater's golden years and younger families looking for wholesome entertainment options for their children. Marcus found himself studying the architectural drawings with growing fascination. His grandfather had worked with a professional architect to develop plans that would preserve the theater's historical character while making it fully accessible and functional for modern audiences. The proposed renovations would restore the original Art Deco decorations, install modern sound and lighting systems, and create comfortable spaces for pre-show receptions and intermission socializing. One section of the plan particularly caught Marcus's attention. Antonio had proposed creating a small museum space in the theater's lobby, displaying artifacts from the building's history and the evolution of cinema technology. The museum would feature vintage movie posters, old projection equipment, and photographs documenting the theater's role in the community over the decades. The idea of a museum resonated with Marcus in ways he hadn't expected. During his military service, he had visited historical sites around the world and had come to appreciate the importance of preserving cultural heritage. There was something powerful about standing in places where significant events had occurred, about connecting with the experiences of previous generations through physical spaces and artifacts. As he continued reading through the business plan, Marcus began to see the theater not just as his grandfather's obsession, but as a legitimate cultural institution with genuine value for the community. The building represented nearly a century of shared experiences, of families gathering to be entertained and moved by stories on the big screen. It was a repository of collective memory, a place where multiple generations had created lasting memories together. The final section of the business plan addressed the question of management and operations. Antonio had clearly recognized that running a renovated theater would require skills and energy that he no longer possessed. The plan outlined a staffing structure that would include a full-time manager, part-time technical staff, and volunteers from the community who could help with events and programming. But there was also a more personal note in this section, a message clearly intended for Marcus. The success of this project will depend on having someone with the vision and determination to see it through. It will require a person who understands both the practical challenges of running a business and the deeper significance of preserving cultural heritage. It will need someone who cares about community and believes in the power of art to bring people together. Marcus closed the business plan and leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what his grandfather had envisioned. This wasn't just about renovating an old building, it was about revitalizing an entire community, about creating a space where people could come together to share stories and experiences, about preserving something beautiful and meaningful for future generations. The scope of the project was daunting, but Marcus found himself intrigued rather than intimidated. His military experience had taught him how to manage complex operations, how to coordinate multiple moving parts toward a common objective. The skills he had developed in planning and executing missions could potentially be applied to the challenge of bringing his grandfather's vision to life. Duke had fallen asleep at his feet, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day's discoveries. Marcus looked down at his faithful companion and thought about the strange way that Duke had led him to the hidden desk in the theater's backstage area. It was almost as if the dog had known exactly what Marcus needed to find, as if some invisible force had guided them to the letters and documents that would change everything. Marcus spent the rest of the evening reading and rereading the letters from his grandfather, each pass revealing new layers of meaning and emotion. By the time he went to bed, he had a completely different understanding of Antonio Rivera and a completely different perspective on his own relationship with the Starlight Theater. The next morning brought a phone call from Janet Caldwell, checking in to see how Marcus was processing everything he had learned during his visit to the theater. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," she said. "You seemed quite moved by whatever you found backstage. I hope it provided some closure regarding your grandfather's feelings." "It did," Marcus replied. "More than I could have imagined. Janet, I need to ask you something. Do you know anything about my grandfather's plans for renovating the theater?" There was a brief pause before Janet responded. He mentioned having some ideas about updating the building, but he never shared the details with me. Why do you ask? Marcus described finding the comprehensive business plan among his grandfather's papers. As he outlined the scope of Antonio's vision, he could hear Janet's surprise and admiration growing. "My goodness," she said when he finished. "I had no idea he had developed such detailed plans. That sounds like an enormous undertaking, but also incredibly worthwhile. The community would benefit tremendously from having a proper cultural center. The question is whether it's actually feasible," Marcus said. "The financial projections look reasonable, but I don't have experience running this type of operation." "But you have other valuable experience," Janet pointed out. "Leadership skills, project management abilities, the kind of discipline and attention to detail that would be essential for a renovation of this magnitude. And you wouldn't have to do it alone. There are people in the community who would support such a project, both financially and with volunteer labor." After ending the call with Janet, Marcus found himself pacing around his apartment, unable to settle down to his normal routine. Duke watched him with patient interest, recognizing the signs of his master working through a difficult decision. The rational part of Marcus's mind catalogued all the reasons why taking on the theater renovation would be a mistake. It would require him to relocate to a small town where he had no established connections, to take on massive financial obligations with no guarantee of success, to commit years of his life to a project that might ultimately fail despite his best efforts. But there was another voice in his head, quieter but more persistent, that pointed out the potential rewards of such an undertaking. The theater project would give him a clear sense of purpose, a way to honor his grandfather's memory while creating something meaningful for the community. It would allow him to use his skills and experience in service of something larger than himself, much as his military service had done. Marcus walked to his kitchen window and looked out at the gray Portland skyline. His current life was comfortable, but not particularly fulfilling. He had his disability pension from the army, enough to cover his basic expenses but not enough to feel financially secure. He had no close relationships beyond his bond with Duke, no commitments that would make relocating difficult. In many ways he was at a crossroads similar to the one his grandfather had faced when deciding whether to buy the theater decades earlier. It was a choice between safety and meaning, between the known and the unknown, between settling for comfort and reaching for something that could be truly significant. That afternoon Marcus drove back to Millfield. This time he didn't go directly to the theater. Instead he spent time walking around the downtown area, paying attention to details he had missed during his previous visits. He noticed the empty storefronts, but he also saw signs of life and potential. There was a small bookstore that seemed to be thriving, a coffee shop with a steady stream of customers, a hardware store that clearly served as an informal community gathering place. He stopped to talk with several local residents, introducing himself as Antonio's grandson and asking about their memories of the theater. The responses were uniformly positive and often deeply emotional. People told him about first dates at the Starlight, about family movie nights that had become cherished traditions, about the sense of loss they had felt when the theater finally closed its doors. "Your grandfather was a treasure," one elderly woman told him. "He kept that place running long after it made any financial sense to do so. He did it because he understood how much it meant to people, how important it was to have somewhere special to gather and share experiences." A middle-aged man who ran a local restaurant shared his own perspective. "I've been in this town for 20 years, and I can tell you that the theater's closing left a real hole in the community. We don't have many places where people of all ages can come together anymore. If someone could bring it back to life, it would make a huge difference." By the end of the afternoon, Marcus had a clearer sense of the community's attitude toward the theater. There was genuine affection for the building and real interest in seeing it restored. More importantly, there seemed to be a willingness to support such an effort, both emotionally and practically. As the sun began to set, Marcus found himself standing once again in front of the Starlight Theater. This time, however, he wasn't seeing it as a symbol of his grandfather's misplaced priorities or as a burden he had inherited unwillingly. He was seeing it as his grandfather had seen it, as a place with tremendous potential, a repository of community memory, a space where art and culture could flourish. Duke had been unusually quiet during their afternoon in town, but now he moved to stand beside Marcus, looking up at the dark marquee with what seemed like recognition and approval. The dog's presence was comforting, a reminder that Marcus wasn't facing this decision entirely alone. Standing there in the gathering dusk, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The resentment and confusion that had defined his relationship with his grandfather began to dissolve, replaced by a growing sense of connection and purpose. Antonio Rivera had been a flawed man who struggled to express his emotions, but he had also been a visionary who understood the importance of preserving beauty and meaning in an increasingly materialistic world. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed Janet Caldwell's number. When she answered, he didn't waste time with small talk. "Janet, it's Marcus Rivera. I've made a decision about the theater. I want to move forward with the renovation project. Can you help me understand what legal steps I need to take to get started?" There was a moment of surprised silence before Janet responded, but when she spoke, he could hear the smile in her voice. "Marcus, that's wonderful news. Yes, absolutely, I can help you with the legal aspects. This is going to be quite an adventure." As Marcus ended the call and looked up at the theater one more time, he felt a profound sense of rightness about his decision.
He was no longer a lost veteran struggling to find purpose in civilian life. He was Antonio Rivera's grandson, inheriting not just a building but a mission, a commitment to preserving something beautiful and meaningful for future generations. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and uncertainties that he couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since his discharge from the army, Marcus felt truly alive, energized by the prospect of taking on a project that would demand everything he had to give. Duke seemed to sense his master's renewed sense of purpose and wagged his tail approvingly. Together they walked back to the truck, both of them somehow understanding that their lives had just taken a dramatic turn toward something extraordinary. 6 months later, Marcus Rivera stood on the freshly polished stage of the Starlight Theater, watching the final preparations for opening night. The transformation had been nothing short of miraculous. Where once there had been dust and decay, now gleaming brass fixtures caught the warm glow of restored Art Deco lighting. The crimson velvet seats had been reupholstered to their original splendor, and the murals on the walls had been painstakingly cleaned and restored to reveal colors that few living people had ever seen. The renovation had consumed every waking hour of Marcus's life, but it had also given him something he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. Each day brought new challenges and small victories, from negotiating with contractors to learning the intricacies of historic preservation regulations. Duke had become the theater's unofficial mascot, greeting workers and visitors with the same steady calm he had once brought to military operations. The project had taken on a life of its own as word spread through the community about what Marcus was attempting. Volunteers had emerged from unexpected places, offering skills and labor that dramatically reduced the renovation costs. A retired electrician had rewired the entire building for the cost of materials alone. A group of local artists had donated their time to restore the lobby's decorative plasterwork. High school students had painted and cleaned for community service credits, their energy and enthusiasm infectious. Marcus had discovered that his grandfather's reputation in the community was far more positive than he had ever realized. People shared stories of Antonio's kindness during difficult times, of reduced ticket prices for families struggling financially, of the old man's willingness to show a child's favorite movie, even when only a handful of people attended. The theater had been more than entertainment for many residents. It had been a source of comfort and continuity during decades of economic and social change. The financial aspects of the renovation had proven challenging but not insurmountable. Marcus had used his military savings as seed money and secured a combination of bank loans, historic preservation grants, and private donations to fund the project.
The business plan that Antonio had so carefully developed proved to be remarkably accurate in its projections, though Marcus had made several modifications based on changing community needs and modern technology. The most significant change had been the addition of digital projection equipment alongside the carefully restored vintage systems. This would allow the theater to show both classic films and current releases, expanding its appeal to younger audiences while maintaining its connection to cinema history. Marcus had also created a small cafe in what had once been a storage area, providing a gathering place for patrons before shows and during intermissions. As opening night approached, Marcus found himself thinking constantly about his grandfather and what Antonio would have thought of the changes that had been made. The core vision remained intact, but Marcus had added his own touches, informed by his military experience and his growing understanding of what the community needed. The theater was no longer just a movie house, it had become a true cultural center, with programming that included live music, lectures, community meetings, and educational events for children. The opening night program was carefully chosen to honor both the theater's past and its future. Marcus had decided to screen It's a Wonderful Life, the same film his grandfather had shown on that snowy Christmas Eve years earlier, to an audience of just 12 people. But before the movie, there would be a live performance by the High School Drama Club, a short documentary about the theater's history that Marcus had commissioned, and a dedication ceremony recognizing all the people who had contributed to the restoration. Duke had been unusually restless throughout the day, pacing the theater and checking on various areas as if conducting his own security inspection. Marcus understood the feeling. After months of preparation, the moment of truth had finally arrived. Either the community would embrace what they had created together, or Marcus would face the possibility that his grandfather's dream had been based on nostalgia rather than genuine need. As the first patrons began arriving, Marcus positioned himself in the restored lobby, greeting people as they entered. The response was everything he had hoped for and more. Children pressed their faces against the display cases containing vintage movie memorabilia, while their grandparents shared stories of their own childhood experiences at the theater. Teenagers took selfies in front of the Art Deco murals, and adults examined the historical photographs that documented the building's evolution over nearly a century. Janet Caldwell arrived early, accompanied by several members of the town council who had been skeptical about the project when Marcus first proposed it. Their expressions of amazement as they toured the renovated space confirmed what Marcus had suspected. Few people had realized how beautiful the theater could be once properly maintained and restored. "Marcus, this is absolutely stunning," Janet said, her eyes bright with tears as she looked around the transformed lobby. "Your grandfather would be so incredibly proud of what you've accomplished here." The evening's program began with Mayor Patricia Hoffman taking the stage to officially welcome everyone to the reopening of the Starlight Theater. Her remarks were brief but heartfelt, acknowledging both Antonio's decades of dedication and Marcus's commitment to bringing his grandfather's vision to life. The applause that followed seemed to echo through every corner of the restored building. The High School Drama Club performed scenes from classic American plays, their young voices filling the space with energy and promise. Watching them perform on the same stage where traveling vaudeville acts had entertained audiences nearly a century earlier, Marcus felt the continuity that his grandfather had worked so hard to preserve. Art and storytelling were timeless human needs, and the theater provided a space where those needs could be met across generations. The documentary about the theater's history proved to be unexpectedly moving. Marcus had worked with a local filmmaker to compile archival footage, photographs, and interviews with longtime residents who remembered the theater's golden age. The film revealed the building's role as a community gathering place during both celebrations and crises, from victory celebrations after World War II to memorial services for beloved local figures. When the documentary concluded, Marcus took the stage for the dedication ceremony. He had spent weeks preparing his remarks, wanting to find words that would honor his grandfather while also acknowledging all the people who had made the restoration possible. Standing in the spotlight, looking out over an audience of nearly 800 people, he felt his grandfather's presence more strongly than ever. 6 months ago I came to Millfield to settle an estate and walk away, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the restored sound system. I thought I understood my grandfather, Antonio Rivera, and I thought I understood this theater. I was wrong on both counts. He went on to describe his discovery of the hidden desk, the letters that had revealed his grandfather's true feelings, and the comprehensive business plan that had provided the roadmap for renovation. As he spoke, Marcus could see people nodding in recognition of the man he was describing, their own memories of Antonio's quiet kindness and stubborn dedication reflected in their faces. This theater represents more than just entertainment, Marcus continued. It represents the belief that beauty and art and shared experiences have value that can't be measured in dollars and cents. My grandfather understood that, and he spent his life trying to preserve it for all of us. Tonight, we're not just reopening a building. We're recommitting ourselves to the idea that culture and community matter, that stories have the power to bring us together across all our differences. The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, but Marcus raised his hand to indicate he wasn't finished. I want to thank everyone who contributed to this project, from the contractors and craftsmen who did the skilled work to the volunteers who painted and cleaned and donated their time. But most of all, I want to thank my grandfather, Antonio Rivera, who had the vision and courage to preserve something beautiful even when it seemed like the rest of the world had moved on. As Marcus left the stage, the curtains parted to reveal the massive screen that had been completely restored to its original specifications. The opening credits of It's a Wonderful Life began to roll, and the audience settled into their seats with a collective sigh of contentment. Marcus found a seat in the back row, Duke lying quietly at his feet, and watched the film that his grandfather had shown countless times over the decades. The movie took on new meaning in the context of everything Marcus had learned about Antonio and the theater. George Bailey's struggle to preserve something meaningful in the face of financial pressure and community indifference seemed to parallel his grandfather's own experience. The film's message about the interconnectedness of individual lives and the importance of community resonated through the restored theater like a prayer. During the intermission, Marcus was approached by dozens of patrons who wanted to share their own memories of the theater and express their gratitude for its restoration. A woman in her 70s told him about her first date at the Starlight in 1962, when she and her future husband had watched Lawrence of Arabia and shared their first kiss during the intermission. A young father described bringing his children to see where their great-grandfather had worked as an usher during the 1940s. The stories continued throughout the evening, and for weeks afterward, Marcus realized that the theater's reopening had unleashed a flood of memories and emotions that people had been carrying for years. The building wasn't just a place where movies were shown, it was a repository of personal and collective history, a space where multiple generations had created lasting connections. In the months that followed, the Starlight Theater exceeded even Marcus's most optimistic projections. The mix of classic films and current releases drew audiences from throughout the region, while the live programming attracted performers and speakers who were eager to appear in such a beautifully restored venue. The educational programs proved especially popular, with school groups making regular visits to learn about film history and theatrical arts. Marcus had worried about his ability to manage such a complex operation, but his military training served him well. The skills he had developed in logistics, personnel management, and strategic planning translated directly to running a cultural organization. More importantly, his experience working with diverse groups of people in high-stress situations helped him navigate the interpersonal challenges that arose when managing volunteers and coordinating community events. Duke had adapted to civilian life with remarkable grace, serving as both theater mascot and unofficial therapy dog for patrons who needed comfort. Children were particularly drawn to the gentle German shepherd, and Marcus often found Duke surrounded by young admirers who wanted to pet him and hear stories about his military service. One evening in late spring, nearly a year after the theater's reopening, Marcus was conducting his nightly walkthrough of the building when he noticed something unusual. In the backstage area where he had first discovered his grandfather's desk, someone had left a small bouquet of wildflowers and a handwritten note. The note was from an elderly woman named Rose Martinez, who had grown up in Millfield but moved away decades earlier. She had returned for the theater's opening night and had been so moved by the experience that she had decided to relocate back to town. The flowers were from her garden, and the note expressed her gratitude for the role the restored theater was playing in revitalizing the entire community. "Your grandfather would be so proud," the note concluded. "He always believed that the theater could bring people home, and that's exactly what it's doing." Marcus carefully preserved the note, adding it to a collection of letters and mementos that documented the theater's impact on individual lives. These personal testimonies had become as important to him as the financial records and attendance figures that measured the project's practical success. Standing on the stage where his grandfather had spent countless hours working and dreaming, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had come to Millfield as a lost veteran struggling to find purpose after military service. He was now a community leader, responsible for an institution that served thousands of people each year and employed dozens of local residents. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, financial crises that required creative solutions, and interpersonal conflicts that tested his leadership abilities. But each challenge had been met and overcome, often with help from unexpected sources. The community that had initially seemed foreign and unwelcoming had revealed itself to be generous, resourceful, and deeply committed to preserving the things that mattered most. Duke padded onto the stage and sat beside Marcus, looking out over the empty seats with the same calm alertness he had shown throughout their military service. The dog had been the catalyst for everything that had followed, his mysterious ability to sense the hidden desk that contained Antonio's letters and business plan. Without Duke's persistence that day, Marcus might have sold the theater and returned to his aimless existence in Portland, never knowing the truth about his grandfather's love and sacrifice. As Marcus turned off the stage lights and prepared to lock up for the evening, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the path his life had taken. He had inherited more than just a building from his grandfather. He had inherited a mission, a community, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to preserve something beautiful and meaningful for future generations. The Starlight Theater was alive again, filled with laughter and tears, and the shared dreams that connect all human beings across time and space. And in that vitality, Marcus could feel his grandfather's spirit, no longer silent, but speaking through every restored detail, every delighted audience member, every child who discovered the magic of storytelling in the warm glow of the theater's lights. Walking home through the quiet streets of Millfield, Duke at his side, Marcus knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for without even realizing it. He was no longer a man running from his past, but someone building toward a future that honored both where he had come from and where he was going. The theater had taught him that the most important legacy anyone could leave was not money or property, but the commitment to keeping beauty and meaning alive in the world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.